is actually going live because it's acting strange. Just give me 1 second. Looks like it is, so it looks like we're good. All right, so the second exam is due by midnight tonight, and I will work frantically to grade those because next week is the third exam. The way this course is set up is because it combines two disciplines, philosophy and marketing. I assume that most marketing students have not had a lot of philosophy, or if you have had philosophy, you took it in your freshman and sophomore year, and you did what everybody does in all of those general education requirements, which is you learned it for an exam in that class and then you dumped it. Most students don't take philosophy, they take humanities because they think that's easier. It contains some discussion of philosophy, but not in depth, and certainly not a lot on ethics. So the beginning of the course, I spend a lot of time going over the philosophical theories, and so there's a pretty significant block of time where we don't have an exam, and then we have an exam. And then at the end, just by the nature of the course, it gets kind of compressed, particularly in the spring, it's a little bit different, but in the fall semester, because we have two breaks that I have to kind of contend with, which is Thanksgiving and fall break in terms of planning assignments out, it's a little more time compression. So next week, it will be the third exam. So again, you'll have class time next week to do the third exam. So we're going to cover employee rights and responsibilities today, and then you'll have the third exam. I will try again. I'm going to a competition tomorrow through Sunday, so I will try to work feverishly after the exam closes tomorrow night on Wednesday to really ramp up and get your second exams graded so that you'll know what you have in terms of going into the third exam, and I will try to do that. It's not going to be as heavy as it used to be. When this course was required, I had a lot more students and it took a lot more time, but since it's no longer a required course and you can take it as an elective, I have fewer students, and so maybe that will sort of help me with grading. So again, if you just walked in next week, third exam, the class will not meet. I will try and get your exams for exam 2 graded as quickly as possible, and that way you will know where you stand on heading into the third exam, because obviously half of the exams are 3 and 4, so you want to know where you're sort of at in terms of the points that are out there. There's still lots of points out there, lots of opportunities for ducks today. You might want to take advantage of that because these are really interesting cases. So we're going to talk about employee rights and responsibilities today. And the reason that we include this in a marketing class is because one of the things that we focus on, and I've mentioned this several times throughout the course, is the concept of living the brand. And I've mentioned Southwest Airlines, and oddly enough, tomorrow I am going to get on an airplane very early in the morning and fly Southwest Airlines to Orlando with our sales team. And I hope we make it there, given the fact that the air traffic controllers are currently not being paid, which is an arresting concept. I think I told you all that I have a commercial pilot's license. I'm also the chairman of the Guthrie Edmond Regional Airport, and I was flying yesterday. I flew back from Texas in my own aircraft, and I flew yesterday afternoon with my great nephew to take him on a discovery flight for his birthday up to Ponca City. And the air traffic controllers were overworked and stressed out, and I couldn't get flight following from Dallas, out of the Dallas area and into Oklahoma, because they were shorthanded, which is sort of really, really frightening when you think about the number of airplanes that are now in the air. Not being able to have radar separation concerns me. Yeah, you had a question?
What are you discovering in Ponca City?
So discovery flight is a term that we use. It was started, I think, by the EAA to denote taking somebody on an introductory flight to introduce them to sort of the fundamentals of
So it's not like you guys are out there exploring.
No, it's like
I was like,
taking,
Ponca
it's
City,
like
man, that can't
taking,
be the most
no, it's,
exciting
there's
place
not,
to do it.
there's not a lot to discover in terms of Ponca City. It's got a really good Mexican restaurant at the airport called Enrique's. And if you've ever eaten there, it is, I am from Santa Fe, New Mexico, so I'm highly critical of Mexican food in Oklahoma. And I'm not as critical of Enrique's only because of one thing. The chips, yeah. The chips are like little pillows of joy. They have the most unique chips I've ever eaten in my entire life. The rest of the menu is pretty much standard Tex-Mex. It's not like Santa Fe New Mexican, but the chips and salsa are well worth the trip. The chips, they deep fat fry them and they puff up. They're like these little, they look like little itty bitty, really little pillows. Yeah, like little mini sopapillas, and they are incredible. I have no idea how they make them. I would like to learn, although I think it takes a lot of deep fat frying, which I just don't really like to do in my house because it creates a huge mess. But we went up there and ate lunch and then flew back. He is 8 years old currently, my great nephew, which is the age at which I started flying. So the age at which I started taking lessons. And I think he wants to take lessons. So that will be my second nephew. If he gets his pilot's license. My other nephew is currently working on his private pilot's license, and he turns 16 in December, so he will solo next month. He's got more than enough hours to do that, and that's very exciting for me. So, but it's frightening that the air traffic controllers are, not being paid because people have a tendency to not show up for work when they're not being paid. It's one of those odd things that happens. And unlike other federal employees, I'm not making a general statement here, but this is not something that you can easily just throw somebody into that role. You can't just say, you're going to be an air traffic controller today. I have a friend who works for the government. He's currently not being paid as well. He works for NOAA and he works in IT, and I'm not discounting what he does, but you can get contractors to do that job in IT if he were to not, he is showing up, but if he were to not show up, you could probably get a contractor to do what it is that he does. And because the contractors are getting paid, they will show up. It's harder to do that with air traffic controllers because it's just not something that people can step into. You can't just send somebody up in a tower or to a center and say, control aircraft. And it's a enormously stressful job. And so even if they are showing up, if you're worried about, losing your house or food, do you want somebody who's controlling aircraft in a highly densely populated area that's already pretty stressed out over finances? Finances are one of the major causes of stress. It's the number one cause for many years, and I think it still is, of divorce in America, is finance and not having the same sort of financial goals. So anyway, just to tell you. So tomorrow I will be on a Southwest Airlines flight, and I say this because we talk a lot about Southwest and living the brand, and so we're going to talk about living the brand. And in order to think about living the brand, we have to talk about employee rights and responsibilities. What is it that we want to give employees to sort of incentivize them to live the brand? And then what are the responsibilities that we expect from them? Now, this has become pretty controversial in the contemporary era because in the past, if you went back to the 1950s and 60s, companies really cared about their employees. And they offered really good benefit packages. And I can give you an example of that from my family's own history. My grandfather worked on the Manhattan Project, which is the building of the nuclear bomb. And he started out in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and then they transferred him to Sandia National Labs in Albuquerque. He was at the above ground testing at the Trinity site in southern New Mexico, where they detonated the first nuclear test, the first above ground nuclear test. And they hypothesized, one of the scientists on the team that developed the lab at Los Alamos National Labs, which is also in New Mexico, hypothesized that there was a slight chance
that when they detonated the bomb, it could create a chain reaction and wipe out civilization as we know it. And they went ahead and did that anyway. So luckily, it didn't create the chain reaction. And we're all still here. You can visit the Trinity site usually twice a year. I think that it's probably not available this fall. It's usually in the fall and the spring because we've had a government shutdown, so they probably canceled the fall visit. It's usually in October. And you can go out there and you can see trinitite, which is the glass that was formed as a result of the heat from the nuclear explosion where they detonated the bomb. He had a heart condition and he died at 35, fairly young. He'd started having heart attacks in his 20s. And the reason I tell you this story is because he worked for Sandia National Labs. And at the time, my grandmother became a widow very early in life, and she had these 2 kids to support. And the president of Sandia National Labs came to her and said, "Tunny, we have a job for you." And they gave her a job because they were going to take care of the widow and orphans of my grandfather and make sure that she was well provided for. Companies don't do that today. No company is gonna, if you don't have life insurance, and he could not get life insurance because he'd started having heart attacks in his 20s. And so that's, that was a disqualifying condition. So what the company did was they hired her to be the classified records librarian for Sandia National Labs. So my grandmother classified all of the nuclear documents and then took them out and stored them in these vaults in the Monsanto Mountains at Sandia in Albuquerque. They don't do that today. I don't know of any company that's going to say, we'll hire the widow and give her a job and provide for her and her children after some tragic incident like a husband, contracting cancer or having a massive heart attack at an early age. That's just kind of unheard of in this day and age. So this has become pretty controversial because in the 1980s, it became very fashionable for particularly large companies to look around and say, we have all these old people and they're taking up a lot of resources, and we can probably hire somebody who's younger and going to work harder and be more productive, and we'll get rid of this workforce. And so they started laying people off. This is, of course, illegal because we have something called the Age Discrimination and Employment Act, the ADEA, but it's really hard to prove that companies are doing this. If they just say we're going to have a downsize and a reduction in force and they lay off massive amounts of people, it's hard to prove that they're doing it because of an age issue. So there was this movement in the 80s and 90s for companies to be pretty ruthless. And then there was this kind of recognition that yes, and if we go back to this idea of Max Weber, which I talked about the bureaucracy, I think the last time, where we view each of these little roles as being a cog in a machine. And if you pull the cog out, you can replace it easily. There's now a recognition that maybe this kind of mentality overlooks something, which is the cost of replacing that employee. It is estimated that for particularly highly skilled jobs, you will lose 20 to 40% of that employee's first year salary in replacement costs. That's recruitment, training, and loss of productivity if these people are just sort of treated as cogs in machines. And so there was a sort of a reconsideration beginning in the 2000s of what is it that we can do to become good workplaces. And now companies want, and they promote the idea that they are someplace that people want to work again in order to get employees to live the brand. So a couple of cases in a previous edition of the textbook, I really like these cases because they allow us to tweak them and look at the nuances of these kinds of situations. So the first case that they had in an old edition of the textbook was the firing of a salesman who was about to be paid a large bonus. He was in his introductory phase of the employment relationship, and they fired him at the end of his introductory phase when he was on sort of a probationary status, and they paid the commission that should have gone to him
to his supervisor, who was his sales manager. Now, the reason I like this case is because I teach professional sales, and one of the things that we find is that, and you can see why this would be attractive, a lot of times people don't want to go into sales management if they're salespeople, because what happens when you go into sales management? Well, you have a higher guaranteed base income usually, but your variable compensation plan generally decreases because the commissions are paid primarily to the people who make the sales. So you could see where if a sales manager eliminated someone who was about to be paid a big commission and they got the commission, there would be an incentive for that manager to get rid of people at the end of their probationary period. Is that ethical?
Did he deserve to get fired? If he deserved to get fired, I would say yes.
Okay, maybe you deserve to get fired, but should you pay the commission to the sales manager or should you pay the commission to the sales man on the way out the door?
I work at a dealership and like it happens all the time. They'll make somebody work all day Saturday, literally all day Saturday,
And then
fire them at the very end of the day. And I'm like, oh my goodness, that is crazy. I'd be so mad. But it happens literally every time.
They have them work the whole day and then
Work from 8 o'clock to 9 o'clock, fire them at the end of the day.
I think that's dangerous.
Yeah, it's messed up.
We here at UCO, you all don't remember this term, but there used to be a term that went around and it resulted as an incident that happened here in Edmond. And you can go and see the statue at the Edmond Post Office.
Going
Where we had
postal.
going postal.
Yeah.
That was a term that was originated in Edmond, Oklahoma, because the post office was apparently such a bad place to work at the time that we had, I don't think we should blame, the post office necessarily, but the idea was that they had created such a hostile environment, this guy came in and shot up the post office. Now, probably in retrospect, we can look at some other factors, PTSD that he suffered from that led to that. But there's a statue. If you go over here, nobody goes to the post office anymore because you all probably don't even, how many of you know how to address a letter? A couple of you. All right. I had several employees recently that did not know how to address an actual envelope because it's not something that you do. And my response was, look at the mail. Go grab a piece of your mail. You get junk mail and look how it's addressed and figure this out. What about mandatory urine analysis for nicotine? This was a healthcare insurance company that decided that since they were in healthcare, they were going to, if you were a smoker, they were going to get rid of you. Workers, yeah. If you worked there and you smoked, they found nicotine in your system, they were testing you for it. And if they found nicotine in your system, they fired you. They gave them, I think, 6 months to quit. But if they didn't, they were gone. UCO now does this. On our health insurance every year, you have to check a box whether or not you are a nicotine user. And if you are a nicotine user, they charge you more for your healthcare premiums under our health plan. Is that fair?
It's crazy.
They do cost, I would say yes, because you're gonna cost more if you get health effects from smoking cigarettes, so.
Harvard has done a study that shows that the net benefit of smokers is actually great because although they do have a lot of healthcare costs, they die quickly. It's people that live a long time that really increase the cost. Like my grandmother on my dad's side lived to be 100. She cost a lot of money in terms of staying in a nursing home those last 6 or 7 years when she had dementia and was in a memory care unit. That's far more expensive than the cancer costs of a smoker, which, yes, it's intense, but it's over, pretty quickly.
Would it
Do
be
you think
good
that's why
business?
a company would punish it? Because it does put you at risk of dying quicker, therefore the company losing an employee. So then they do charge you more because you're gonna cost them in the long run.
You're losing all that tacit knowledge.
Especially for life insurance and medical insurance. they don't disclose that they are a smoker and do end up dying earlier.
Okay. Well, should you fire them though, or should you just charge them if they are a smoker?
I think it's not fire, but
They fired him.
Maybe after giving them 6 months, cause it's like, hey, like, we're telling you that like, we don't want this, so we're gonna give you a chance.
Now, let me tell you what the company did after that. After that, they said if your spouse is a smoker and it shows up, if you quit and it shows up in your urine or your hair sample, we'll fire you, even if your spouse smokes.
Is the
Everyone's
health
supposed to get
insurance
fired, cause everyone's
mandatory?
experienced secondhand smoke.
Do we? I can't remember. It used to be, so when I started in college, years and years and years ago, we could actually smoke in the buildings. Professors could smoke in the classrooms. We could actually smoke. And then we could only smoke. So I was a liberal arts major here at UCO, and we could only smoke in the south hallway. Cause the smoke doesn't waft to the north hallway at all. And then we could smoke in the union and that was it. And then we could only smoke in the basement of the union. Cause that's healthy. Keep all of the smoke. And it doesn't, again, smoke doesn't rise up to the second and third floor, right? And then we could smoke nowhere in the buildings, but we could still smoke on campus. So you would see, particularly for example, here in the business building, as I go look, I think there's an awning at this west door over here.
Yeah.
Yep, there is. So you would have to battle a huddle of smokers who were standing under the awnings between classes. And then they said you had to be 50 feet from the doors, I think, and you could smoke. And then you couldn't smoke, like out in the open, so people would run to their cars. And you would see these during the breaks between classes before everybody started taking online. There would be like these smoke signals going up from people's cars as they were, and then you couldn't smoke on campus. And so people were getting in their cars and driving across the street to smoke. And now I think most people have kind of given up on smoking, during the workday because it's become such a problem. But should you be able to fire people for something that's legal?
I would say it's based on if the health insurance is mandatory or if they opt into it or not.
What about alcohol then?
It goes to the extent of affecting your job. I mean, if that's the case, then it affects the company in general. I mean, it just goes back to how much does it cost the actual company if you're doing that something.
I've been negligent handing out ducks, sorry.
You have to be careful because alcohol could be considered, like alcoholism could be considered a condition.
Yeah,
under the ADA, so you could-
what about smoking? That's an addiction. Is it a disability under the ADA? I don't know.
it doesn't
That's,
necessarily hinder your job.
Does it hinder your,
alcoholism is probably more problematic than smoking, I would think. And there are studies that now show that no amount of alcohol is safe. I don't know how much I trust those studies. I went to law school, therefore, everybody who went to law school drinks at some point. I mean, I went to law school with a Southern Baptist minister's daughter who had never smoked or drank her entire life, and after the first semester, not sure she drew a sober breath, and she was a smoker after that. What about firing an employee who's considering having an abortion? This one has become, again, highly contentious as a result of the overturning of Roe versus Wade.
how far should your job creep into your personal life? Like a lot of these, it's like the job is creeping into like personal life in a way I think is unethical and a bad idea, business wise.
They claim, this employer claimed that they didn't fire her because she was having an abortion, but because she created a hostile work environment when she revealed the fact to one of her coworkers that she was going to have an abortion. And the coworker, who was adamantly pro-life, made a big stink in the workplace. Why not fire the coworker? Right?
At that point, it's not even really for her considering abortion, it's straight up just for a hostile environment. And that could be something worth firing for, because that affects other employees.
It's not a hostile environment though, that sounds like a bunch of BS, an
But
excuse.
there's some things that just should not be brought up at work. And
The truth of the matter is that we all reveal a lot about ourselves.
We
at
do,
work, don't
we do, but
Bringing up
there's some,
politics is.
yeah,
like
there's some things that like, especially if you don't know the other person, like you should not just be throwing your business out there, especially something that deep,
What if
because
they-
you never know.
What if they did though? What if they were co-workers for a long time and then someone she thought she could trust, so this is very vulnerable and she thought, but if she doesn't have a lot of friends, I want to try to connect, like this is something personal.
I think, you know, the long and the short of it is, I think you really need to think about what you choose to reveal. Now, we
Yeah.
reveal so much about ourselves anymore. When I started teaching years and years and years ago, we didn't have PowerPoint. Think about this, I'm a Gen Xer, we didn't have PowerPoint. We had a chalkboard, overhead projectors where people made transparencies and put them on. I've gone over to the land of hippy dippy across the parking lot, and there are still some of those old history professors over there that are still using an overhead there's still some overhead projectors over there. And there's still, and I was talking to a student in my class last semester who said that one of her professors, she was a fashion marketing major, that they still use transparencies over in human environmental science, which is where fashion marketing is, to show textiles. You can get that online. Like, you can Google it and find examples of patterns. This one has become less a big deal, but I remember the first person to die of what they called gay-related immune deficiency syndrome in New Mexico was a tenant of my mother's. So I grew up in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Santa Fe has a large homosexual population. And in the late 1970s, when it was first, when this disease first popped up, it was a death sentence. That's no longer the case. And it's no longer as expensive to treat HIV/AIDS as it used to be. But at the time, it was really expensive. And it could create huge amounts of healthcare costs. And, now the chances of you dying of AIDS are less than you dying with AIDS. But it was a big deal at one point in time. Should we pre-screen? Now, as a result of the Affordable Care Act, pre-existing conditions are no longer can no longer exclude them. And so we've dealt with this through legislation, but are there other things that will pop up? Should we, instead of having HIV testing, should we engage in genetic testing? If you're gonna, and then screen people out as a result of something that may occur if they have a high likelihood of contracting some kind of rare form of cancer. This one is not at all controversial for you all. It was when I was growing up, because I remember when emails started out, employee emails and screening. This one actually is the result of a very famous case called Connick versus Myers. And you all probably have never heard of the famous son of the defendant in the initial case, who then became the appellant in the subsequent case. So it started out as, in many instances, court cases start out as, for example, Myers versus Connick at the trial court level, and then they switch the names. They actually don't do that anymore, but some courts still do, I guess. But at the appellate level, it became Connors versus Myers. The son of the appellant in that case was a guy named Harry Connick Jr. You all probably have never heard of him. He was a rather famous actor at one point in time and jazz musician from New Orleans, and his father was the district attorney of Orleans Parish for something like 50 years. And he had an employee who was using their email system with the early days of email to basically criticize his administration. And the question was, could they use her emails against her in firing her? And I think that most of you realize that your emails are not private, that your employer can look at them, and that they can use those against you. At that point in time, it was pretty controversial, and there was a second factor to that case. Because she was a public employee, she had some First Amendment rights. So as a college professor, for example, I have some First Amendment rights, and they can't violate those without running a risk of the law coming down on the university if they were, for example, to try and silence me in terms of what I said in a classroom, if it's related to my academic discipline. In the private sector, you have no such expectation. And your employer can obviously use your employees' emails, and you have no access to those, right? And so I don't think that's nearly as controversial as it used to be. The next one is more controversial. Using pre-employment psychological testing to determine whether or not you're going to hire somebody. Now, the test that most companies use is one that I am extremely critical of because it is completely not scientific, but they love it. I don't know why. We had it given to us here at UCO one time as an exercise in a College of Business retreat. The dean just thought this was great, that we were going to do Myers-Briggs. How many of you have taken the Myers-Briggs assessment? It is a pseudo-scientific instrument. It is not validated. It is not, it drives me crazy, but companies love it. Why? Why is the Myers-Briggs not scientific? Well, it's not, consistent. You can take it one day and be an ENTJ and take it the next day and be something totally different, right? A more sophisticated form, and some companies do use this, is something called the Minnesota Multi-Phase Personality Inventory, the MMPI. That one is an instrument that's been validated, but companies don't like to use it because Myers-Briggs, you can get online and you can take the Myers-Briggs. So there's lots of versions of it out there. The MMPI is expensive to take. It's expensive to administer, and it takes a long time. I think the MMPI consists of something like 500 questions that it asks you to respond to. So it's expensive. This one, again, may run afoul of the ADA. Now, as we understand neurodivergence, my sister-in-law is a professor of management, and she teaches about, her area of specialty is looking at neurodivergence in the workforce and how you deal with neurodivergence in the workforce. And I think pre-employment psychological testing may run afoul of the ADA and the Rehabilitation Act, because we now understand so much more about what it is to be neurodivergent, right? And is that a disability? It is. Does it affect a major life function? It does. And so it's one of those things that I think employers really need to be very careful in dealing with this. This one is actually the last one has Oklahoma roots as well, denying positions to females that may be detrimental to their pregnancy. This one is a result of the Karen Silkwood case to some extent. There used to be a nuclear facility on the Cimarron River up in Crescent. Crescent is a little town that is about 15 miles north and west of Guthrie, which is where I'm on city council. My niece was actually on city council in Crescent until she moved out of Crescent to Cimarron City, which is kind of close to where this plant was. She's now the mayor of Cimarron City. And so there was this nuclear plant where they manufactured stuff for reactors, light water reactors, I think. And some of the female employees were exposed to radiation. There's a term, you can watch the movie that came out as a result of this. The movie was called Silkwood. It stars Meryl Streep, and she is actually killed at the end of the movie, and people hypothesize that it may have been Kerr-McGee trying to eliminate her from being a whistleblower. She was going to meet an investigative reporter in Oklahoma City at the time, and she was killed on the road, which is Portland Avenue that runs into Oklahoma City right outside. But they discovered that as a result of that case, that this exposure to radiation may, and in other settings as well, chemical plants, may affect your pregnancy. Should we
deny women the ability to work in those facilities if it could detrimentally impact their pregnancy or their fetus.
I don't think so. I don't think so, personally. I think people should be allowed to make what other people think are poor decisions. And if they know all the risks,
Sure, there are people who smoke during pregnancy.
I would say as long as
You
the
know.
company's not held liable.
if, yeah, they know the
Yeah.
risks and they sign off, be like, blah, 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 I think it's fine, so.
The problem with that, so you bring up an interesting point. The problem with the liability aspect is that you can't waive somebody else's fundamental rights. And if the child is born and ends up having a serious medical condition as a result of exposure to neonatal chemicals or radiation, can you extinguish their right? I don't think you can. I don't think you can extinguish their right. It's the same thing that happened with diethylstilbestrol, which I think we'll talk about that case after the third exam. I'm getting ahead of myself, which is, it was a drug that actually crossed the placenta and created some adverse impacts later on in life for these people.
Would that fall more on the mother at that point if she had like said like, you know, like I'm fine with this, whatever, and then
So you're gonna sue your mother?
I mean,
I guess you could. The problem with that is that we have something called strict liability in this country. Right? We have this theory in tort called strict liability, and we'll talk about that when we talk about products liability. You're strictly liable. Doesn't matter. You know, strict liability, yeah.
Couldn't you technically say that for the guy as well? I think there's been studies that come out that like 80% of the sperm is actually affects like can cause stillbirths or something like that.
There are. So it was thought for a long period of time in medicine, and this is the way science works, it progresses, right? We understand things better now than we did, you know, a decade ago even. There was a theory that, you know, trisomy 21, for example, was strictly a result of older female motherhood, right? There's now evidence that older fathers, I think, as I understand it, may contribute to the chances or the likelihood of that condition and other medical conditions as well. Yeah. So yeah, I think, this case actually involved, they would give the females the job if they agreed to be sterilized. That seems pretty extreme, doesn't it?
Not everyone must have children. You could adopt children. I don't think so.
That's
but I think
interesting.
forcing
Is that just comes down to it?
sterilization, those kind of crazy.
That's interesting. When I was growing up, everybody pretty much, I was very unusual in that I said from a very early age that I never wanted to have children. And I have never had children because children interfere with my ability to spend money on me. So I was very unique in that for most of my life. Oddly enough, more and more people are choosing not to have children. My wife said that she didn't want to have children either, and then she had 5 after we got divorced, so I guess she didn't want to have children with me. Perfectly okay. So, because I still didn't want to have children, so whatever. So these are, interesting examples, and they lead to a discussion on what is it that we can expect in the workplace, and how do we make a moral workplace where people want to work and they want to engage in living the brand. Work is controlled by others. And so when we talk about rights, we can talk about rights in 3 senses. We can talk about legal rights, which are things that we have as a result of the Fair Labor Standards Act, the Occupational Safety and Health Act, administered by the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, the Family Medical Leave Act, the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, and others. The Americans with Disabilities Act, the
ADEA, the Americans, the Age Discrimination and Employment Act, and those kinds of things. Now, those are imposed by the federal government or state governments, and they impact your ability to do things. So in many states, for example, you can still, I think, discriminate against people who are homosexuals in the employment setting. In places like California, they've expanded what would be covered under the Title VII and the Civil Rights Acts of 1964, and the court cases like Brown versus the Board of Education, which create a common law idea that we can't have discrimination in employment. Those have not historically extended to gays and lesbians and others, but other states are now, like California, New York, I think Vermont, Connecticut, all those blue states are extending those to a greater and greater percentage of the population. A second idea, and one of the ones that we'll think about, are contractual rights in the workplace, because employers and most companies now rely on the doctrine of employment at will, which means that you can be fired for any cause or no cause, just not the wrong cause, have relied heavily on that. Now, what is the wrong cause? Why can't you fire somebody? You can't fire them because of protected classes or categories. Now, I'm going to tell you as an employment lawyer, most places, and it's very hard to prove discrimination in a lot of settings, although there are more and more juries that are becoming sympathetic to it. One of the things that I would advise clients on when I was a plaintiff's, or when I was a defense attorney rather than a plaintiff's attorney, was I would take them, if they had a case that involved employment discrimination, down to Walmart, and I'd say, pick out 12 people, that's your jury. That jury didn't look like anybody that I was dealing with, right? Everybody's had a bad boss at some point in time. I'll tell you, if you haven't had a bad boss, you're lucky, but you will. At some point in time, you will have a bad boss. I've had one. And he was a nightmare. And he told me that he was going to get me fired, and I was like, I was here before you, and I'll be here when you leave. I'm still here. So, it's everybody's had a bad boss, and juries are, if you can survive summary judgment and you can get to a jury, you better watch what you do, right? In terms of these kinds of violations of contractual rights. What we really focus on in this class is moral rights. What is it that we can expect in the workplace? What are we entitled to? Legal rights have moral implications, and they often result in, they're often the result of moral failures. Why do we have the Occupational Safety and Health Act, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration? At the beginning of the 20th century, we employed people in really horrific working conditions in textile mills and other kinds of factory settings. And often those workers were children. And those children, because kids are not necessarily really responsible, we know a lot more as a result now of studies on human brains, that the frontal cortex is not fully formed until you're about 25, which means that impulse control is lacking. And they would lose fingers and arms and digits and things like that. And so we got the idea that you have to have safe workplaces, and you can't employ children in dangerous settings like mines and textile factories and things like that. Those were results of moral failures that led to legal consequences and legal rights. One of the things that we talk about when we talk about moral rights is things like the right to work. Now, right to work laws have moral implications in and of themselves, and we'll talk just a bit about this. These have become increasingly popular. Lots of states have passed what are called right to work laws. What are right to work laws? They sound, and the reason that they pass is because they sound good. It means that you cannot be forced to join a union if they have a union shop at the employment that you are going to work at. You can't be forced to join the union. Now, unions argue that this allows for a free rider problem if you're not forced to join the union. You technically can't be forced to join the union even in places like Illinois, where they don't have right to work laws, But what you can be forced to do is to cover your portion of the costs, which basically is joining the union, for collective bargaining. And if you can't force people to cover the costs, you have the free rider issue, which is what the unions worry about, which is I'm gonna take the benefits of the negotiated contract through the collective bargaining agreement, but I'm not gonna share in the cost of that. Is that ethical? If you work for a company that has a union and they negotiate on your behalf, you get the advantage of all of those benefits that they negotiate, but you don't pay the cost. Is that ethical?
To be fair, they negotiated before I got there.
They negotiated before you got there. They negotiate contracts every year usually. So at some point, that's not gonna be the case.
Ours is until 2027.
So you're saying that you shouldn't be forced to join the union because they negotiated this and you didn't have any say in voting on this contract that they've negotiated through 2027. Surprised that they went that far out, but
It's, we're one of two stores in the entire.
okay. Lots of companies attempt to discourage. It's illegal to do that,
I've heard
But,
that they've tried to.
you know, but they try, really hard to discourage unionization. So how do you overcome the free rider issue? Well, one of the ways that you can do it is the union could become better marketers. They could offer benefits that you don't get if you're not a union member, besides the benefits of contract negotiation. How do other, not companies, but organizations overcome the free rider problem? For example, the American Association of Retired People, the AARP, which since I am 55, I now get these lovely solicitations from AARP. I think I started getting them at 50 actually, is,
At any time.
huh?
You can join it at any time.
You can join at any time, that's correct. And why do people join AARP? Knowing that they're gonna go lobby on behalf of old people. Why would I join AARP? Well,
That's your discount.
you get discounts. You get lots and lots of discounts if you join AARP on things like, things that old people like to do, cruises, resorts, travel. Okay. A second sense of the idea of right to work is not about right to work laws and being forced to join a union. It's, do we have an obligation to provide work to people who want it? And if so, who should provide that work? The Holy See's position is that maybe we should. We should provide that. During the Great Depression, we did this. Massive numbers of people were out of work and suffering. And so FDR created the Works Project Administration, the WPA. You can go across campus and you can see buildings that were built as a result of that legislation. He put people back to work, building bridges and dams and roads and buildings, public buildings. So if we say that you should have the right to a job if you want one, who's gonna provide that job? Well, some moral philosophers argue that one of the things that we could do is we could require businesses to spend more and employ more people. We give businesses an enormous advantage called limited liability to allow for the pooling of capital. This is an enormously important incentive that is given to businesses to allow them to really ramp up and scale, because no one would invest in Ford Motor Company if they were 100% liable for everything that Ford did. You're only liable to the extent of your investment. Now that gives you an enormous advantage. Maybe as part of that, we should require businesses to spend a certain percentage of their profits. Now this becomes hard to monitor. Because businesses are good at showing no profits. A more interesting sense and less controversial is once you have a job, what is your expectation of continued employment? As I suggested, employers and particularly the private sector cling to this idea of the doctrine of the employment at will. You don't have an employment contract, you're free to leave at any time. Again, one of the problems with relying on that is A, if you can survive summary judgment as someone who's been both a plaintiff's and a defense attorney in the employment sphere, if you get somebody who survives summary judgment, the jury is going to look like none of the executives that made the decision to fire somebody. And B, if you have become known as a place that people don't want to work because you cling to this so dearly, you're not going to get employees to live the brand. It becomes a purely transactional relationship. And if the relationship is purely transactional, are employees going to give 110%? And the answer is no, they're not. Employees who feel that the company values them oftentimes give more and they value the company. So I talked about employment at will. What does due process look like in the workplace? If we say that employees should have rights, what does due process look like? Well, there are two types of due process. There's procedural due process and substantive due process. PDP and SDP. Substantive due process is a recognition of sort of fundamental rights. What does it mean to have a fundamental right? Well, in the workplace, it means that you should have autonomy, right? And those substantive rights are bodily autonomy, integrity, the ability to make decisions for yourself that are not coerced out of you. Those substantive rights are protected by procedural due process. So what is the heart of PDP or procedural due process? It's notice and hearing. And you find this in employee handbooks, which always start with, this does not create an employment contract. Every employee handbook says that. But you should be careful, again, when you do this, because if you start violating your own policies, you look arbitrary and capricious, and you can get to a place where a court or a judge and jury decide that you have created an employment contract. Notice and hearing, the opportunity to be heard if you are about to be terminated, right? Oftentimes this takes the form of progressive discipline, which is the idea that you coach somebody rather than just firing them for certain things. You want to encourage them to improve. Now, how much notice and hearing do you have? Well, it depends on how severe the consequences are. And I've suggested to you in the past that here at UCO, for example, if we take really severe consequences like throwing you out, you have a lot more rights than if you're just protesting a grade that I give you on an exam, for example. Right? There's a big difference qualitatively between failing an exam and expelling you from the university, isn't there? The more dramatic the impact on your, sort of well-being, the more procedural due process you should have. Now, of course, private sector employers argue that the free market, property rights, and efficiency really should limit what you do. Now, what I would push back on is that if you don't have some due process in the workplace, again, employees don't feel appreciated and they're less likely to engage in really 100% effort, 110% effort of, their job. Participation rights, workplace democracy, again, in the private sector, these are very, very controversial in places like UCO. They're less controversial because I have First Amendment rights. I have a skill that it's hard to monitor. It's hard to tell whether or not I am making an impact on you. One of the things that is one of my functional fictions is that I sort of think that I come down here and I inflict knowledge on you. And as a result, you come out and you have better skills than you did when you started. But that's really hard to measure. It's not like measuring whether or not I put the tire on the Buick correctly at the factory. The more your work involves things that are difficult or intangible and hard to measure, the more participation rights really are important. Because it is important that you get buy-in from employees, because if you don't, one of the things that we saw as a result of COVID that became a sort of staple term in employment and human resource management circles was called quiet quitting. What's quiet quitting?
You slowly start doing less and less of your job.
Yeah, you just do the minimum amount of work that's required in order to skate by, right? You're just going to turn in the reports that are necessary. You're not going to give it your all. And that can be really hard. Now, again, if you have employees that are doing things like assembling the Big Mac at McDonald's. What is the Big Mac? This should, like, I've done this song and dance routine a couple times for you. It was a big thing when I was growing up, the commercials. What is a Big Mac? 2 all beef patty, special sauce, lettuce, cheese, pickles, onions on a sesame seed bun. What?
How do you have this memorized?
I have lots of things memorized. As a result of having taught criminal law and procedure for years and years and years, I can recite the Miranda rights. Maybe some of you can do that as well. You have the right to remain silent. If you give up the right to remain silent, anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney and have an attorney present at your questioning. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you by the court. You'll remember that, right?
Law and Order?
Huh?
From Law and Order?
Law and order. When the man with the badge is talking to you, what do you need to do?
Stop
Shut
talking.
up. Yeah, stop talking. You can say 2 things. Am I free to go? And if they say yes, you need to do what?
Leave.
You need to go. If you're not free to go, what did you say? I want my lawyer. Exactly, yeah. Yeah. At the point at which you are not free to go, you need to say, I want my lawyer. So if what you're worried about is somebody doing 2 all beef patty, special sauce, lettuce, cheese, pickles, onions on a sesame seed bun, you don't need a whole lot of participation rights. Well, you don't want them getting creative with this. But in a law firm, you want somebody who has creative defenses or creative ideas on how to prosecute a case, right? Again, this becomes controversial because managers insist that, again, they have property rights, that managers have expertise, and that it impacts efficiency. I don't know. Lots of companies that have done really, really well have lots of participation rights. Companies like Southwest. Disney, historically, they've given lots of people. Now, Disney sort of has 2 classes. They're kind of an interesting case study because you have Imagineers at Disney. These are the people who come up with rides and ideas. And then you have people who are supposed to make sure that you get into the coffin car in the Haunted Mansion safely. And that you are told to keep your arms, hands, legs, head, and body inside the ride at all times. Obviously, employee health and safety is a big part of this that we have to think about. We talked about privacy in the workplace as well. Those are things that we should think about. You don't have to provide it. But again, if you don't have some degree of feeling of autonomy, and respect and self-worth in the workforce, how much are you likely to give your employer? I would argue that you're probably not likely to give a whole lot. Let's talk about employee responsibilities. If you have rights, you have responsibilities. Why did that not open? So rights are what others owe to us. It's what the company owes to us. These moral, contractual, and legal rights. Responsibilities are what we owe to others. So given the fact that work is controlled by others, what should we owe them? Again, if you went back in time to my grandmother's situation, I would say that a company that goes out and says, look, we're gonna provide for the widow. Now, it was not that my grandmother was unqualified. She had a master's degree, she had been a teacher, and so she could learn the job of being, I mean, it wasn't like they just took, a housewife. My grandmother actually had to stop teaching because at the time she was born, if, this was not true of men, but if you were a woman, if we go back in time, if you were a woman and she was born in London, Kentucky, and she taught in a one-room schoolhouse, and the minute you got married, you could no longer be a teacher, if you were a woman. If you were a man, you could still be a teacher. But if you're a woman, you got married, couldn't be a teacher. Because you were no longer chaste. Crazy, right? So the narrow view of responsibilities looks at sort of an agency framework. What are the duties of agency? You're acting on behalf of your employer. Well, they're the duty of loyalty. This one is controversial because if the company doesn't have loyalty to you, loyalty implies that you are going to sacrifice. You are willing to sacrifice for something else. If the company's not loyal to you, should you have loyalty to the company? In the strictest sense of the word, what loyalty means is that you don't engage in self-dealing. You don't find out that the company's going to do something and go out, for example, that they're going to buy land and you go out and buy the land yourself and then sell it to the company at a higher price, right? Under this very narrow view in the idea of loyalty. The duty of obedience, which is to do what they tell you to do. If they tell you to bolt the tire on the Buick, you bolt the tire on the Buick. And then the duty of thrift, which is to engage in no waste. What's the biggest form of waste probably among intellectual employees or white collar employees?
Socializing?
It's time theft. Yeah, it's time theft, right? Now, what I would argue is that if you don't have some of that, people don't socialize at work, are they really that productive? Particularly in a creative environment. Why is it that a lot of the tech companies have gone to having this open concept in the workforce? Well, it's because you need to be able to collaborate easily. Now, I would argue that for some of us, that doesn't work very well because some of us have, ADD. And being in a loud, noisy, cramped room doesn't help that. Many employment roles now, as we become more and more professional, have professional ethics, codes of ethics. One of the things that we're trying to do in sales is we're trying to elevate the sales job to a professional status, which is why we're offering a degree in professional selling. What are the learned professions? So the oldest professional codes are derived from the oldest professions. What are the three original professions for which you went to higher education to get those? Well, the first is theology, right? It's the clergy. That's the reason that most universities historically were established, was to impart knowledge to the clergy. Out of that grew canonical law and the legal profession. So that's the second oldest profession. And then the third, medicine. Right? Those are the three historic learned professions. All of them have very explicit codes of conduct. The lawyer's code of professional responsibility is a book, very thick book with all these rules. and commentary on the rules, about how to apply the rules. We're seeing more and more professions adopting these. ICMO, the International Council of City Managers, has adopted a code of ethics for professionals. And so these play an important part in transmitting sort of a culture of ethics to a lot of people. But there are many professions and many organizations that don't have them. Should you establish them? If you don't, if you're not covered by a specific code, I would say that maybe you should. This also involves managerial responsibilities and conflicts of interest as part of this idea of a code of ethics and a code of behavior. And it really depends on whether you're talking about corporate versus non-corporate and the responsibilities. I think in a corporate setting, you have a far larger organization usually, and so it's much more likely that people can rely on this idea of anonymity and engage in maybe unethical practices than it is in a smaller non-corporate setting in a small business where you have a lot of interaction. I see this one, the first classes that I taught years and years and years ago was a class that was not required, and they gave it to me and it was at night and it wasn't a very popular topic, and I had like 3 students in the class. And it was a course that, although it wasn't required, it was a guided elective, so they let the class make. And I was really concerned in that class that I would just be standing there and talking and there wouldn't be a lot of discussion. And what I found was that in smaller classes, there's actually a lot more discussion that actually goes on because it's less likely that you can rely on the factors of anonymity. Whereas when I teach the lecture hall series of principles of marketing with 100 and something odd students in there, everybody can rely on the fact when I ask questions that they can slink down in their chair, put their baseball cap over their eyes, and sort of not make eye contact. It's harder to do in a class like this where you've got 12 people that I can stare you down. And I've become pretty good at, now not as good as some of my colleagues. I've got one colleague who she'll sit there and just stare. If she'll ask a question, nobody will answer. She'll just stare at somebody until you can tell if somebody's staring at you. You can feel it. So one of the things that we have to look at is that this is highly contextually specific. If we have a large organization versus a small organization where it's harder to sort of be anonymous and maybe engaged in unethical behavior. Whistleblowing. Whistleblowers oftentimes do not end up well. So philosophers who have studied this suggest that there are 3 things that you have to do before you become a whistleblower and you go external outside the company, like what happened in Enron, where the reason we found out that Enron was engaging in these unethical practices was because their own employee turned them in. So what are the things that you have to do in order to be a whistleblower and make sure that you don't risk severe harm to your reputation as well? Because a lot of times, again, these people they're marked for life and they don't get jobs because if you do this, other companies, and particularly in an age in which information is so prevalent, even though we cannot require you to give us your Facebook access, can people find it? Absolutely. If you put something on Facebook, it's incredible to me, the things that people put on Facebook, my students put on Facebook, or Insta, or even LinkedIn. It's there. People can find it. There has to be a real threat, not a hypothetical threat, is one of the first things. So there has to be a real threat. In Enron, there was a real threat. They were engaging in highly unethical accounting practices. You have to seek to prevent the harm through internal means. This is required by Sarbanes-Oxley, right? And other laws in big corporations, but it's not if it's not a publicly traded company. So what should smaller organizations do? How should you monitor this to allow employees to participate and express things. Well, you know, in a small company like my family's business, we own a series of bed and breakfasts. It's maybe easier and harder to do because we have such a small number of employees that you know, like they can't anonymously file a tip if they think that something's not going the way they think it should. Whereas here at UCO, we have something called the ethics hotline. Or ethics point is what I think they call it, where you can file an anonymous, you know, complaint. The university is required to do something about it. Finally, you have to use the doctrine of exhaustion, which means that you seek to prevent the harm through internal means and you exhaust all of those remedies that are available to you. Let's think about this in terms of you. If you want to file a grade appeal against me, what do you have to do? Well, the first thing is you do have to talk to me and say, I don't think this is a fair grade. Because maybe I can resolve it informally. Then if that doesn't satisfy you, you go talk to the department chair. If you're not satisfied, then you talk to the dean, and then you can file a grade appeal, which goes in front of faculty members and students, right? Before you go file a lawsuit in federal court, they're gonna tell you have to exhaust those remedies. Because if you don't, you're wasting public resources to do it. So we've talked about the meaning and value of work. We've talked about employee rights and responsibilities. And ultimately, what I want you to take away is that companies that get this balance right oftentimes have employees who engage in living the brand. And that pays dividends. If you can get employees who feel valued and live the brand, it will, I think, in many instances, be far more beneficial in the long run. And there may be short-term costs to implementing these kinds of things through your employee policies and procedures manual, but ultimately, it will pay dividends, I think, in the long run. All right, so you guys, bunch you got ducks today. I'm gonna stop the live stream. Come see me.